And now, God, open my mouth so that I can speak, open our ears so that we can hear, and open our hearts so that we can change by your power and through your grace. Amen. Please be seated. Rituals and traditions can often be funny things. Some people build their whole lives around them, finding comfort in their rhythm and return, while others bristle at the sameness and repetition. Some even make ritual and tradition out of swearing off ritual and tradition. I admit that I'm a ritual and tradition guy. Eric is too, and it's one of the ways in which we find some of our deepest connection. It's how we've charted almost a decade together. He was laughing at me the other day because I realized this week that in just about 3 short months, it'll be time for one of my favorite rituals, decorating our house for Christmas. Admittedly, while we may hold Advent deeply in our hearts, we don't really hold it in our home decor. I call it a ritual, though, because each year it begins with the careful unpacking of all of our Christmas items and sharing with each other about the significance of each item or ornament for us and oftentimes for our families. It's been a big part of how we came to understand each other's stories. It's through this and the other traditions and rituals, some massive and some mundane, that we brought to our relationship, that we've learned so many things about each other because the things we do communicate things about us that words cannot. I guess it's not entirely a bad thing to be a ritual and tradition guy for a priest. Everything we do here on Sundays is part of an elaborate ritual that's been passed down through the generations that connects us to those who've come before us and to each other. It's a huge part of how we find common ground. Here, we all come to the table on equal footing. We don't all come from the same place, some from the center and some from the edge. We don't all have the same resources or have identical family systems. But when we come here, none of that matters. At least, it's not supposed to. The funny thing about traditions and rituals is that they can be used to bring people in and help them connect with something bigger than themselves and to each other. And they can be used to keep people out and lead to isolation and discord. Today we find ourselves back in Mark's telling of the gospel story, and I love Mark's gospel because in it, Jesus actually doesn't say very much, but when he does, it's usually pretty important, and today he's not pulling any punches. By this point in Mark's telling, Jesus has made a name for himself. He can no longer move about in anonymity. Everywhere he goes, people seek him out for healing and teaching. A contingent of Pharisees and scribes have come from Jerusalem to see what all the fuss is about, and they notice that his disciples are not following the practice of washing their hands before they eat, thus rendering them ritually unclean and unfit to eat. They question Jesus about how he can support this, and he uses a quote from Isaiah that all of them would have known and understood immediately to give them the biblical version of side-eye, and basically tells them that they're focused on the wrong things. It's important to point out, though, that Jesus never says the ritual is meaningless. But here again, we have evidence that Jesus is after our hearts more than the acts we perform so that we can say we've checked all the boxes. Now, our passage today has a couple of gaps in it. And what we didn't hear in the reading is that Jesus goes on to illuminate their hypocrisy by pointing out how sometimes the tradition of the elders conflicts with God's commandments by using the example of their complicity with people using their offerings to the Jerusalem temple as an excuse to not honor God's commandments given to Moses to care and honor for one's father and mother. Jesus had little patience for hypocrisy, and I feel like Mark always does a brilliant job of highlighting that. But the real thrust of this passage begins when Jesus turns from the Pharisees and scribes and addresses the crowd again. Listen up, he says. The issue is not what you take in, but with what you put out. And I picture those Pharisees standing there gritting their teeth as this man they're coming to despise is unraveling things right in front of them. After the reading we heard, and the reading we heard today makes it seem like the last line is delivered to the crowd, but it's not. That may seem like an anecdotal detail, but when we understand that in the second gap in the passage today, Jesus goes into a house and is alone with his disciples when he says this, we may find something else, something a little bit more nuanced. He goes into the house, and the disciples ask him to explain what he meant with what he said to the Pharisees. And he encourages them not to get caught up in being overly concerned with the food that they eat and how they eat it. Food goes into the stomach and out of the body. It's temporary. What he calls them to, and in doing so calls us to, is to pay attention to what comes out from our hearts. And he rattles off a list of heart-driven behaviors that very often get people into a lot of trouble. Now, the reason I think it's notable that this was a conversation with the disciples is that when we understand the context in which Jesus spoke these words, it allows us to see that even the disciples, those closest to him, struggled with what he was teaching. And the reason they struggled is because change is hard. Changing the way we think is not always a snap, even when change is brought to you by someone you respect or by someone you've put your trust in, especially when it seems to contradict everything you've been taught by good, thoughtful, and well-intentioned people. It's important to remember that the Pharisees and scribes were not an across-the-board group of terrible people. Most of them took their role seriously and saw their role as service, as in service to their communities and to God. To dismiss them outright would be unfair and cast an irrelevant light on the traditions of our Jewish siblings. That is not the point of this moment. The point of this moment is that Jesus was highlighting for them, for the crowd, and for his closest friends that the rituals had been given more power and reverence than God. He was pointing them to the heart and soul of the matter, which is that what we put out in our families, in our communities, and in the world has more influence than what we take in. He was saying that our rituals and traditions should first and foremost be life-giving outward expressions of who we are and how we live in relation to God and the world around us. As I've said before, anyone can follow the rules and guidelines. Most of us can do it without even thinking too much about it. Many of us know when to sit or stand in church or when to make the sign of the cross and so on, but knowing the rules isn't enough. And that's what Jesus was talking about. James drove this home beautifully in his letter today when he says, "Be doers of the word, not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they're like those who look at themselves in a mirror, for they look at themselves and on going away immediately forget what they were like." Caroline Lewis of Luther Seminary writes that what James is talking about is an essential mark of discipleship. That what you say and what you do, and I would add, what you post on social media, are not separate from who you are, period. Your words and your actions are indeed windows through which to view your soul. And those who think they can convince others of their ideas as separate from their true self are delusional. As we move through this year's complex election cycle, I wish many of our politicians would understand this. She continues to say that this is a come to Jesus text, if you will. That is, if you expect to follow Jesus, then this will demand an excruciating examination of yourself, your true intentions, your true beliefs, and on what you stake your relationship with God. What truths do your rituals and traditions tell? What is it that they communicate that words cannot? What stories do they tell, and what do they say about you and what matters to you? What truths do our rituals and traditions here at church tell? What is it that they communicate that words cannot? What do they say about us and about what matters to us as a community? Do they reflect the people we are trying to be for each other and our community? I hope so. Do we use them to invite people from the edge to the center? Or do we use them, perhaps even unconsciously, to barricade the center so that those on the edge cannot break through? I wonder. Reflection like this isn't easy, and we may find some things we don't necessarily like as a result. But the good news is that we don't have to stay mired down in that. We can choose to change. We can choose to be different and trust that Jesus will be there walking with us as we embark on a journey of transforming our hearts, because Jesus knows that when love flows from our hearts, wounds are healed, people are fed, and creation thrives. And all of that honors the God who created us all and whose heart of love for us is beyond our imagining. Let us move beyond lip service and let the loving heart of God that is alive in Jesus Christ and active in the Spirit of truth come alive in our hearts in service of others. Because as you have so often heard in my favorite final blessing at the end of our services, the world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. Amen.